So Charles Spencer just basically admitted on live television that the story he sold to the world about his divorce, the story everyone believed for literal decades, completely unravels the moment you look at the actual timeline. And I cannot stop thinking about the fact that he said the quiet part out loud with the camera rolling, like it was just a minor clarification when what he actually did was pull the thread that could unspool his entire public reputation. Here's the thing that got me. Charles Spencer has spent years, and I mean years, positioning himself as the truth teller of his family, the one who broke away from the palace machine, the guy who wrote a book, gave the interviews, stood on the world stage at his sister's funeral, and made a promise to protect her sons that sounded like a vow of vengeance wrapped in grief. And people believed him because the story was clean. He was the protective brother. He was the one who saw through the institution. He was the man who got his nephews out. It's a compelling narrative. It's also apparently not the whole story. The interview I'm talking about happened recently, and the question was about his divorce from his first wife, Victoria Atkin. Now, if you followed the narrative, Charles Spencer has maintained since the 90s. The divorce was a tragedy that happened to him. His wife left, took the children to South Africa, and he had to fight through the courts just to see his kids. That's the version that lived in every profile written about him. The arraigned father, wounded but righteous, battling through a foreign legal system. It's a powerful story. It's also based on what he just said, not exactly what happened. So the interviewer asks him about that period, and Charles Spencer, without any visible awareness that he's about to contradict decades of his own public relations, says that he agreed to Victoria moving to South Africa with the children. He agreed. He said yes. He didn't fight it. He didn't lose a custody battle. He gave his consent. And then, and this is where my jaw actually dropped, he said he did it because he knew he couldn't take care of 4 children under the age of 6 by himself. He said he couldn't do it. He knew his limitations, so he let them go. Wait, what? Because that is not the story. That is categorically not the story that has been out there for almost 30 years. The story that was out there was that she left. She took the kids, she went to South Africa, and he had to spend years and a fortune fighting through courts just to maintain a relationship with his own children. That's the story that made people sympathetic to him. That's the story that made the custody battles seem like an injustice rather than a consequence. But if he agreed, if he said yes, if he looked at the situation and decided that was the best option, then what exactly was the fight about later? What changed? Did he change his mind? Did she refuse to come back? Because that's a different story. That's not my wife took my children. That's I agreed to an arrangement and then later decided I didn't like it. And those are not the same thing. Like if that's true, then the entire foundation of his public persona shifts. Charles Spencer has built his reputation on being the man who stands up to institutions, who refuses to be silenced, who fights for family against overwhelming odds. But the decision he just described, the one he made as a father of 4 children under 6, was to let them go because he couldn't manage, which honestly is a very human thing to admit. Raising 4 children that young alone is incredibly difficult. I'm not saying it's not. What I'm saying is that's not the story he sold. The story he sold was about a mother who took his children away. Not a mother who left with his agreement because he recognized his own limitations. Those are 2 completely different narratives, and one of them made him a victim and the other one makes him a man who made a practical decision and then perhaps regretted it later. But it gets more complicated when you start connecting this to everything else about Charles Spencer. This is a man who has positioned himself as Diana's protector, as the one who saw through the royal family's treatment of her, as the uncle who would make sure her boys were raised with truth and love and freedom from the institution he clearly despises. He gave that funeral speech. You remember it. Everyone remembers it. He stood in Westminster Abbey in front of the royal family, in front of the world, and he promised Diana's spirit would live on through her sons. And he basically promised to protect them from the forces that he believed destroyed her. It was a declaration of war wrapped in eulogy. And people cheered. People thought finally someone is saying it. Someone is standing up. But now when you look at that moment through the lens of what he just admitted about his own divorce, you start to see a pattern. Charles Spencer is very good at telling a story where he is the righteous one, where he is the victim of circumstances, where institutions or other people are the problem. And he's so good at it that even the people involved might start to question their own memories. But the timeline of his divorce, the actual facts he just stated on camera, don't support the story he's been telling for 30 years. And if that story isn't true, or at least isn't complete, then what else in the Charles Spencer narrative needs to be re-examined? Take his relationship with his nephews Harry and William. After Diana died, Charles Spencer became their guardian in a symbolic sense. They spent time at Elthorpe, the family estate. He was supposed to be the connection to their mother's side of the family, the counterbalance to the Windsor influence. And for a while that seemed to be working. Harry has spoken warmly about his uncle in the past, but things have shifted. And Charles Spencer has been noticeably absent from some key moments in recent years. He wasn't at Harry and Meghan's wedding in a prominent role. He hasn't been publicly vocal in support of Harry's various battles with the press and the royal family. In fact, he's been pretty quiet, which is interesting for a man who made his name by being loud about family loyalty. Now, I'm not saying there's a feud. I'm saying that the same patterns of behavior Charles Spencer has displayed in his own personal life, the ability to craft a narrative, the willingness to let a certain story stand, even when the facts don't quite match, the positioning of himself is the wrong party. Those patterns might make a person wonder what his nephews have experienced in their relationship with him. Because if you can let the world believe your ex-wife abducted your children when you actually agreed to the arrangement, what else can you let the world believe? And let's talk about Althorp for a second, because that estate is central to understanding Charles Spencer. He inherited it when he was very young after his father died. It's a massive property, historic family seat, and it cost an enormous amount of money to maintain. Charles Spencer's been open about the financial pressures of keeping Althorp going. Oh, Thorpe. He's written books. He's done speaking engagements. He has monetized his family history, including his sister's memory, to keep that estate afloat. There's a museum at Alford dedicated to Diana. There's a memorial people pay to visit, and that's fine. Historic homes do this. But it does mean that Charles Spencer has a financial interest in maintaining a certain public image and a certain public sympathy. The story of the wrong brother, the protective uncle, the truth teller, that story sells tickets. That story sells books. That story keeps Althorp relevant. But what happens when the story starts to crack? What happens when a man who has built his entire public identity on being the one who tells the truth, no matter how uncomfortable, casually reveals that he's been letting a false narrative about his own divorce circulate for decades? Doesn't just damage his credibility on that one issue. It makes you look at everything else he's ever said with fresh skepticism. Think about the stories he's told about his childhood, about his parents, about his boarding school experiences. Charles Spencer has spoken extensively about the trauma of his upbringing, about being sent away to school, about the coldness of his family, and I'm not dismissing any of that. Childhood trauma is real, and the British upper-class system of sending children to boarding school at young ages is genuinely damaging for many people. But when you realize this is a man who knows how to shape a narrative, who knows what details to emphasize and what details to leave out, who has just admitted on camera that the public story about his divorce isn't accurate, you have to at least consider the possibility that other stories have been shaped too. Not invented, shaped, curated, edited for maximum sympathy and minimum personal responsibility. The thing about Charles Spencer that always struck me as odd was how quickly he turned his sister's death into a platform. The funeral speech was powerful. Genuinely, it was a moment of real emotion and real anger. But within a very short time, there was a museum, there were books, there were interviews, there was a whole industry built around being Diana's brother. And yes, he was protecting her memory and her legacy, but he was also building his own profile. He was also making himself a public figure. He was also generating income and attention for Althor. And there's nothing inherently wrong with any of that, except that it was all built on a foundation of moral authority. He was the one who knew the truth. He was the one who would say what others wouldn't. He was the one who could be trusted because he wasn't part of the institution. But now he's admitted that for 30 years the story about why his children moved to another continent wasn't true. Or at least it wasn't complete. And he admitted it like it was nothing. Like it was just a small clarification. He didn't seem to realize what he was doing. He didn't seem to understand that he was undercutting his own mythology. And that honestly is the most revealing part. It suggests that Charles Spencer has been telling these stories for so long that he's forgotten which parts are true and which parts are the version he prefers. He's lived inside the narrative for so long that the narrative has become his reality. So that's where it gets weird, because if you can't trust the story about the divorce, the story that was foundational to his public image as a father fighting for his children, then what else can't you trust? Can you trust the stories about his childhood? Can you trust the stories about his relationship with the royal family? Can you trust the stories about his sister's marriage and her struggles and her confidences? Charles Spencer has been one of the primary sources for a lot of the Diana mythology that has shaped public understanding of the royal family for decades. He's the one who said what she supposedly thought and felt and wanted. He's the one who positioned himself as her voice after she was gone. But if he can let a false narrative about his own life stand for 30 years, what narratives about her life has he let stand? What narratives has he shaped? I'm not saying he's lying about Diana. I'm saying we now have proof that Charles Spencer is comfortable allowing the public to believe things that aren't accurate, as long as those beliefs serve his interest or protect his image. And that's a problem. That's a credibility problem that extends to everything he's ever said publicly. And here's the thing about credibility problems. Once they exist, once there's a documented instance of someone letting a false story circulate because it's more convenient or more flattering than the truth, you can't unsee it. Every interview, every speech, every book passage suddenly reads differently. You start noticing the gaps. You start noticing the things that are emphasized and the things that are glossed over. You start wondering what the other people in the story would say if they were asked. Victoria Aiken, his first wife, has barely spoken publicly about their marriage or their divorce. She's maintained her privacy for decades, but Charles Spencer just gave an interview where he admitted that the story everyone knows isn't what happened, and she's still not saying anything, which is her right. But it does make you wonder what else she could say if she chose to. And what about his other marriages? Charles Spencer has been married 3 times. His second marriage, to Caroline Freud, ended in divorce as well. His third marriage, to Karen Gordon, seems stable and they have a daughter together, but the pattern of relationships ending, of children living in different countries, of public narratives that may or may not match private realities, that pattern exists. And Charles Spencer has always been the one telling the story. He writes the books, he gives the interviews, he controls the narrative, but control isn't the same as truth. And we just got a glimpse of the gap between the two. The broader implication here isn't really about one divorce or one interview. It's about the way we consume celebrity narratives, especially narratives from people who position themselves as truth-tellers. Charles Spencer made his name by standing up and saying the things the palace wouldn't say, by being the authentic voice in a family of carefully managed images. But authenticity can be performed. Truth-telling can be a brand. And the man who built his brand on telling hard truths just casually revealed that he's been letting an easy lie circulate for 30 years. That's not a small contradiction. That's a foundational crack. When you actually look at what was said versus what happened, the timeline of Charles Spencer's divorce narrative doesn't add up. He said he fought to see his children. He now says he agreed to the arrangement. He said his wife took them away. He now says he knew he couldn't care for them alone. Those two versions cannot both be true. And if the version he's been telling for 30 years is the false one, then Charles Spencer has been lying about the most personal, most emotionally charged experience of his adult life. Not exaggerating, not simplifying. Lying, letting a story stand that he knew wasn't accurate because it made him look better. And if he can do that about his own divorce, about his own children, about his own stated limitations as a father, then he can do it about anything. He can do it about his childhood. He can do it about his parents. He can do it about his sister. He can do it about his nephews. He can do it about the royal family. He can do it about every single topic he has ever spoken on publicly. That's the problem with losing credibility on something fundamental. It doesn't stay contained, it spreads. Now, maybe there's more to the story. Maybe the agreement he made with Victoria was under duress. Maybe the legal battle later was about something else entirely. Maybe the full truth is more complicated than either the public narrative or his recent admission. That's possible. But Charles Spencer didn't offer that context. He didn't explain the discrepancy. He just stated a fact that contradicted his own myth and moved on, apparently unaware of what he'd done, which suggests he doesn't think about consistency the way someone who's telling the truth thinks about consistency. People who are telling the truth don't have to remember which version they told. People who are managing a narrative do. So now I'm looking at every Charles Spencer story differently. The childhood trauma, the boarding school horrors, the complicated relationship with his parents, the protective brother act, the funeral speech, the museum, the books, the interviews, all of it. Because once you know that the man is capable of letting a lie about his own children stand for 3 decades, you have to ask what else he's capable of letting stand. And more importantly, you have to ask who else's story he's been telling, and whether they would tell it the same way. The fact that he won't address the contradiction directly, that he just dropped this bombshell and moved on like it was nothing, is honestly the weirdest part. If you genuinely believed your ex-wife took your children and you fought for years to see them and then later you realized that you had actually agreed to the arrangement, wouldn't you want to explain that? Wouldn't you want to clarify how you came to understand the situation differently? Wouldn't there be some emotional processing visible? But there wasn't. It was just a fact. A casual throwaway fact that happened to destroy the narrative he's been selling for 30 years. And that lack of effect, that flatness, that inability to see what he'd just done, that's the thing that makes me think the narrative was always a construction. A story he told so often he forgot it wasn't true. Charles Spencer is a man who has made a career out of being the authentic one, the one who says what others won't, the one who stands up for family against institutions. But the one thing he apparently can't do is stand up for the truth about his own choices. He couldn't do it 30 years ago when he let the story of the abducted children circulate. And he can't do it now when he admits the truth without acknowledging what it means. That's not authenticity. That's image management. And the image he's been managing is of a man who would never let his children go when the reality is that he did let them go, because he knew it was the practical thing to do, which is a very human decision, but it's not the decision of the man he's been pretending to be. So where does that leave us? It leaves us with a Charles Spencer who is less reliable than we thought. It leaves us with a family narrative that needs to be re-examined. It leaves us with the uncomfortable possibility that a lot of what we think we know about Diana, about her childhood, about her relationship with her brother, might be filtered through a man who is very good at telling stories and not very good at sticking to the facts. And it leaves us with the question of what Harry and William know, what they've experienced, and why they've both in their own ways created distance from the uncle who once stood at their mother's funeral and promised to protect them. Thanks for watching. If you're enjoying these deep dives into royal family dynamics and the narratives that shape public perception, please subscribe to our channel. We're breaking down the stories behind the stories, and there's a lot more to unpack. See you in the next one.